When their eyes met across the courtroom, time stopped. Judge Amara Williams gripped her bench as recognition flooded through her. The defendant in orange jumpsuit wasn't a stranger. He was Marcus, her childhood friend, who had vanished from her life 20 years ago. What had happened to the boy who once dreamed of changing the world? And why was he now facing the most serious charges of his life? But to understand what happened in that courtroom on a humid Thursday morning in downtown Atlanta, we need to go back to the beginning. Back to two kids growing up in the same neighborhood, sharing the same dreams, and making promises they thought would last forever. Amara Williams and Marcus Thompson first met when they were 7 years old in the playground of Martin Luther King Jr. Elementary School. It was Amara's first day at a new school after her family moved to Atlanta's West End neighborhood, and she stood alone by the swings, clutching her backpack and trying not to cry. Marcus was the first kid to approach her. He was tall for his age, with bright eyes and a smile that seemed to take up half his face. "You're new," he said, not as a question but as a simple observation. "Want to be friends?" From that moment, they were inseparable. Marcus lived 3 blocks away from Amara's apartment, and every morning he would walk the extra distance to pick her up for school. They did homework together at the kitchen table in Amara's apartment, where her grandmother would feed them both and tell them stories about the old days. Marcus was brilliant in a way that made teachers take notice. He could solve math problems that stumped kids 2 grades ahead of him, and he read everything he could get his hands on. Library books, newspapers, even the legal documents his mother brought home from her job as a paralegal. He would tell Amara about Supreme Court cases like they were adventure stories, explaining how lawyers used words and logic to fight for justice. "I'm going to be a lawyer someday," Marcus would say, sitting cross-legged on Amara's bedroom floor with law books spread around him. "I'm going to help people who can't help themselves." Amara would nod seriously, even though she was more interested in the math homework they were supposed to be doing. But she loved listening to Marcus talk about his dreams, the way his whole face lit up when he discussed cases like Brown Board of Education or talked about Thurgood Marshall. "What about you?" Marcus asked one afternoon when they were 12. "What do you want to be?" Amara thought for a moment. "A judge," she said finally, "like the people who get to decide if the lawyers are right." Marcus grinned. "We'll work together then. I'll argue the cases, and you'll make sure justice gets done." They were 13 when everything started to change. Marcus's mother lost her job at the law firm, and his family struggled to pay rent. Marcus started working after school, bagging groceries and washing dishes, trying to help his family make ends meet. He had less time for homework, less time for dreams about law school. Amara watched her best friend change. The boy who had once talked excitedly about Supreme Court cases now came to school tired and distracted. His grades started slipping. Teachers who had once praised his potential began to write him off as another kid from the neighborhood who wouldn't amount to much. "It's not fair," Amara told her grandmother one evening. "Marcus is smarter than anyone in our class, but nobody cares anymore." Her grandmother looked up from the dinner she was preparing. "Life ain't fair, baby girl. But that doesn't mean you stop fighting. You just fight harder." When they were 15, Marcus made a choice that would change everything. Desperate to help his family and tired of watching his dreams slip away, he got involved with a group of older kids who promised easy money. It started small, delivering packages, keeping lookout, running errands that seemed harmless enough. Amara saw the signs: new clothes, new sneakers, a confidence that bordered on arrogance. She confronted Marcus one afternoon after school, cornering him by his locker. "What are you doing, Marcus? This isn't you." Marcus looked around to make sure no one was listening, then leaned closer. "You don't understand, Amara. My mom's about to lose the apartment. My little sister needs medicine. I can't just sit around reading law books while my family falls apart." "There are other ways," Amara insisted. "Scholarships, financial aid programs that help kids like us." Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Kids like us. Look around, Amara. Kids like us don't get to be lawyers and judges. We get to be statistics." That was the beginning of the end of their friendship. Marcus pulled away, spending time with his new friends and avoiding the places where he might run into Amara. She tried to reach out, leaving notes in his locker and calling his house. But Marcus had made his choice. The last time they spoke was 3 weeks before graduation. Amara found Marcus sitting alone in the school library, staring at a book he wasn't really reading. "I miss you," she said simply, sitting down across from him. Marcus looked up, and for a moment, Amara saw the boy she had grown up with, the dreamer who had wanted to change the world. "I miss you too," he said quietly. "But things are different now. They don't have to be. We can still keep our promise. We can still work together for justice." Marcus closed the book and stood up. "Justice is for people who can afford it, Amara. The rest of us just try to survive." That summer, Marcus disappeared. Amara heard rumors that he had been arrested, that he had left town, that he had gotten in too deep with the wrong people. She tried to find out what had happened, but it was as if Marcus Thompson had simply vanished from the world. Amara threw herself into her studies with renewed determination. She graduated valedictorian, earned a full scholarship to Spelman College, and then went on to Harvard Law School. Every achievement felt hollow without Marcus there to share it, but she pushed forward, driven by the promise they had made to fight for justice. She worked as a public defender for 5 years after law school, representing the kids who reminded her of Marcus, bright, talented young people who had made bad choices in impossible circumstances. She won more cases than she lost, earning a reputation as a fierce advocate for the underserved. When a judgeship opened up in Fulton County Superior Court, Amara was the youngest person ever nominated for the position. At 35, she became Judge Williams, presiding over the same type of cases she had once argued as a defense attorney. For 8 years, Judge Williams built a reputation for fairness, compassion, and an unwavering commitment to justice. She was tough but not cruel, understanding but not permissive. She remembered what it was like to grow up in neighborhoods where opportunity was scarce and second chances were even rarer. And then, on a humid Thursday morning in July, Bailiff Robert Chen called the next case on the docket, the state of Georgia versus Marcus Thompson. Charges include armed robbery, assault with a deadly weapon, and possession of a controlled substance with intent to distribute. Judge Williams looked down at her notes, scanning the case summary. Repeat offender, lengthy criminal history, facing a potential sentence of 15 to 20 years if convicted on all charges. Another life destroyed by choices made long ago. She looked up as the defendant was brought into the courtroom. He was wearing an orange jumpsuit, hands cuffed behind his back, flanked by 2 deputies. His head was down, shoulders hunched in defeat. "Mr. Thompson," Judge Williams said in her professional courtroom voice, "please approach the bench for arraignment." The defendant raised his head and took a step forward. That's when their eyes met across the courtroom, and time stopped. The man standing before her was older, thinner, marked by years of hard living. There were lines around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and difficult choices. His hair was shorter, his face more angular, but the eyes were the same. Those were Marcus's eyes, filled with intelligence and pain and the weight of dreams deferred. Judge Williams gripped her bench so hard her knuckles went white. She felt the courtroom spinning around her, 20 years of questions flooding back in an instant. What had happened to the boy who had wanted to be a lawyer? How had he ended up here, in her courtroom, facing charges that could put him away for most of the rest of his life? Marcus stared back at her with the same shock of recognition. His mouth opened slightly, as if he wanted to say something, but no words came out. The boy who had once explained constitutional law to a 12-year-old girl now stood silent in handcuffs, facing the friend who had become the judge he had once dreamed of being. The courtroom was silent, waiting for the proceedings to continue. The prosecutor, defense attorney, court reporter, and gallery of observers had no idea they were witnessing a reunion 20 years in the making. To them, this was just another case, another defendant, another day in the pursuit of justice. But Judge Williams couldn't speak. She couldn't move. She was 7 years old again, standing by the swings at Martin Luther King Jr. Elementary, watching Marcus Thompson approach with that bright smile and an offer of friendship. She was 13 again, listening to him talk about Thurgood Marshall and Supreme Court cases. She was 15 again, watching him walk away from everything they had planned together. "Your Honor?" The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Park, stepped forward with concern. "Are you all right?" Judge Williams blinked, forcing herself back to the present. She was a judge. She had a courtroom to run, laws to uphold, justice to administer. Whatever personal history she shared with the defendant, she had a job to do. "Yes," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm fine. Please proceed with the arraignment." But as the prosecutor began reading the charges against Marcus Thompson, Judge Williams found herself listening to more than just the legal language. She was hearing the story of a brilliant boy who had lost his way, a childhood friend who had made choices that led him to this moment. "Miss Thompson," she said when the prosecutor finished, "how do you plead to the charges against you?" Marcus looked directly at her when he answered, "Not guilty, Your Honor." His voice was different, deeper, rougher, worn down by years of hardship. But there was something else in it, something that reminded her of the boy who had once promised to fight for justice. Judge Williams set a trial date and dismissed the court for a recess. As Marcus was led away by the deputies, he glanced back once, and their eyes met again. This time she saw something she hadn't expected: hope. That afternoon Judge Williams sat in her chambers, staring at Marcus's case file. The details painted a picture of a life that had gone off the rails early and never recovered. First arrest at 17 for drug possession. Multiple charges over the years for theft, assault, drug dealing. Time served in county jail, state prison, probation violations, a pattern of recidivism that was depressingly familiar. But she also saw something else in the file that others might have missed. Marcus had earned his GED while in prison. He had completed a paralegal certification program. He had volunteered to tutor other inmates preparing for their high school equivalency exams. Even in the worst circumstances, he had tried to better himself and help others. There was a knock on her chamber door. Her clerk, Patricia Rodriguez, peered in with concern. "Judge Williams? Is everything okay? You've been in here for 2 hours." Amara looked up from the file. "Patricia, I need you to do something for me. I need you to research the recusal process for cases where a judge has a personal connection to the defendant." Patricia's eyebrows rose. "A personal connection to Marcus Thompson?" "We grew up together," Amara said simply. "We were childhood friends. I haven't seen him in 20 years, but I think I need to step aside from this case." Patricia nodded slowly. "I'll pull the relevant statutes and case law. But Judge, if I may ask, why haven't you recused yourself already?" Amara leaned back in her chair, considering the question. "Because I'm not sure what the right thing to do is. Marcus deserves a fair trial from an impartial judge, but he also deserves someone who understands where he comes from, someone who knows he's more than just his worst mistakes." That evening, Amara drove through her old neighborhood for the first time in years. The apartment building where she had grown up was still there, but it looked smaller and more run down than she remembered. The playground at Martin Luther King Jr. Elementary had new equipment, but the old oak tree where she and Marcus used to sit and plan their futures was still standing. She parked her car and walked to the tree, running her hand over the bark where they had once carved their initials. A.P.I.M.E. BFF, surrounded by a lopsided heart. The carving was faded now, barely visible, but it was still there. "I wondered if you'd come here." Amara spun around to find Marcus standing about 10 feet away. He was out of his jumpsuit, wearing jeans and a plain t-shirt, but she could see the electronic monitoring bracelet around his ankle. "He must have made bail, Marcus." She said his name like a prayer, like a question, like an accusation all at once. "Judge Williams," he replied, and there was a formality in his voice that broke her heart. They stood there for a long moment, 20 years of silence stretching between them. Finally Marcus spoke. "You did it," he said. "You became a judge, just like you said you would." "You were supposed to become a lawyer," Amara replied. "We were supposed to work together," Marcus laughed. But it was the same hollow sound she remembered from high school. "Life had other plans, I guess." "What happened, Marcus?" "After graduation, you just disappeared. I tried to find you, but nobody knew where you'd gone." Marcus sat down on the ground, leaning against the oak tree. After a moment, Amara joined him, her judicial robes seeming out of place in this setting. I got arrested 3 weeks after graduation, Marcus said. Drug dealing. My lawyer told me to plead guilty. Said I'd get probation since it was my first offense. But the judge saw a young black man from the projects and decided to make an example. Gave me 2 years. Amara felt her heart sink. I didn't know. When I got out, everything was different. My mom had moved away. My scholarship opportunities were gone. Felony conviction meant most employers wouldn't hire me. So I went back to the only thing that had ever made me money. The drugs. Marcus nodded. Each time I got caught, the sentences got longer. Each time I got out, there were fewer options. It becomes a cycle, Amara. The system isn't designed to rehabilitate people like me. It's designed to warehouse us. Amara wanted to argue, to point out the programs and opportunities that existed, the second chances that were available. But she had seen enough cases in her own courtroom to know that Marcus wasn't entirely wrong. The charges against you now, she said carefully. Are they true? Marcus was quiet for a long time. I was there, he said finally, but not for the reasons they think. The victim was a dealer who had been threatening kids in the neighborhood, selling to middle schoolers, recruiting them to work corners. I went there to talk to him, to try to get him to leave the kids alone. And he pulled a gun on me. We struggled. The gun went off. Nobody got shot, but he got hurt when he fell. When the police came, they found drugs in the apartment and assumed I was there to buy or sell. Amara studied his face in the fading light. After 20 years, she could still tell when Marcus was lying. Right now, he was telling the truth. Why didn't you tell your lawyer this? Who's going to believe me? Ex-con with a long record versus a citizen with no priors. My court-appointed attorney advised me to take a plea deal. 15 years instead of 20. 15 years. Amara repeated the words, thinking about what that meant. Marcus was 37 years old. 15 more years in prison would take him to 52, past the age when most people could hope to rebuild their lives. I can't be your judge, Amara said suddenly. I have to recuse myself from your case. Marcus turned to look at her. Why? Because I can't be impartial. Because every time I look at you, I see the boy who taught me to believe in justice. Because I made a promise 20 years ago to fight for what's right. And I can't do that from behind a bench when you're the one standing trial. And what happens then? I get some other judge who sees another black criminal with a long record and decides I'm not worth saving. Mara stood up, brushing dirt from her robes. No, you get the lawyer you should have had from the beginning. Marcus stared at her. What are you talking about? I'm talking about stepping down from the bench temporarily and representing you myself. The words surprised her even as she said them. She hadn't planned it, hadn't thought it through, but as soon as the words left her mouth, she knew they were right. That's crazy, Marcus. You can't give up being a judge to defend me. That's not how the world works. Maybe it's time the world worked differently. Amara replied. Maybe it's time we kept the promises we made when we were kids. 3 weeks later, the courtroom was packed with reporters and observers who had heard about the unprecedented case, a sitting judge who had recused herself to defend a childhood friend. Legal experts debated whether Amara's actions were ethical, inspiring, or simply misguided. Amara sat at the defense table wearing a business suit instead of judicial robes, with Marcus beside her looking cleaner and more hopeful than he had in years. Across from them, Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Park shuffled through her notes, clearly frustrated by the unexpected turn the case had taken. Judge Robert Martinez, who had taken over the case, called the court to order. Ladies and gentlemen, this is an unusual situation, but the law is clear. Every defendant has the right to competent counsel, and Judge Williams has temporarily stepped down from her position to fulfill that role. We will proceed with the trial. Amara stood to make her opening statement, feeling nervous in a way she hadn't since her first year out of law school. She looked at the jury, 12 men and women from Marcus's community, people who knew what it was like to grow up with limited options and systemic barriers. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, she began, this case is about more than the charges against my client. It's about second chances, about the difference between justice and revenge, about whether we believe people can change. She told them about Marcus's childhood dreams, his intelligence, his desire to help others. She explained the circumstances that had led to his first arrest, the cycle of incarceration and recidivism that had trapped him for 20 years. And she told them about the night in question, when Marcus had gone to protect children in his neighborhood and ended up fighting for his own life. The prosecution's case was strong but not overwhelming. They had Marcus at the scene, they had evidence of the struggle, and they had his criminal history. But they couldn't prove intent to rob, couldn't prove premeditation, couldn't prove that Marcus was anything other than a man trying to protect kids from a predator. Amara cross-examined witnesses with the skill of someone who had spent years on both sides of the courtroom. She poked holes in the timeline, questioned the police investigation, and highlighted inconsistencies in the state's case. But more than that, she painted a picture of Marcus as a human being, flawed, damaged, but fundamentally decent. On the third day of trial, Amara called Marcus to the stand. It was a risky move. Putting a defendant with a criminal record in front of a jury was always dangerous. But she knew the jury needed to hear from Marcus himself, needed to see the man behind the charges. "Mr. Thompson," she began, "tell the jury about your childhood dreams." Marcus looked uncomfortable in his suit and tie, but his voice was steady when he answered. "I wanted to be a lawyer. I wanted to help people who couldn't help themselves. What happened to those dreams?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, looking out at the packed courtroom. "I made some bad choices when I was young, got caught up in the system. After a while it felt easier to give up on the dreams than to keep fighting for them. Tell the jury about the night of March 15th. Marcus straightened in his chair. "I heard from some kids in the neighborhood that Jerome Davies was pressuring them to sell drugs for him. These were middle school kids, 12 and 13 years old. I knew Davies from the old days, and I thought maybe I could talk to him, get him to leave the kids alone." "Why did you feel responsible for protecting these children?" "Because I know what it's like when adults fail kids. I know what happens when nobody stands up for them. I didn't want these kids to end up like me." The prosecutor's cross-examination was aggressive but not devastating. Marcus admitted to his criminal history, acknowledged that he had made mistakes, but maintained his innocence on the current charges. By the time he stepped down from the stand, the jury had seen him not as a career criminal, but as a man who had been knocked down repeatedly, but was still trying to stand up. In her closing argument, Amara spoke directly to the jury's sense of justice and compassion. "Marcus Thompson is not a perfect man," she said. "He has made mistakes, served his time, and tried to rebuild his life. But the question before you today is not whether Marcus has ever done wrong. The question is whether he committed these specific crimes on this specific night." She walked closer to the jury box, making eye contact with each juror. "The prosecution wants you to convict Marcus based on who he used to be, not on what the evidence shows he did. They want you to look at his past and assume his guilt. But that's not justice. That's prejudice." She paused, thinking about all the defendants she had represented over the years, all the young people who had reminded her of Marcus. Marcus Thompson went to Jerome Davies's apartment that night to protect children. He fought back when Davies pulled a gun on him. He survived a violent encounter and is now being punished for not dying. That's not the kind of justice any of us should be comfortable with. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood to read the verdict. "On the charge of armed robbery, we find the defendant not guilty." Amara felt her knees go weak with relief. "On the charge of assault with a deadly weapon, we find the defendant not guilty." Marcus grabbed her hand under the table, squeezing tight. "On the charge of possession with intent to distribute, we find the defendant guilty." The last charge was a disappointment but not a surprise. The drugs had been found in the apartment, and even though they belonged to Davies, Marcus's presence there made him technically liable under Georgia law. Judge Martinez sentenced Marcus to time served plus 2 years probation. After 20 years of cycling in and out of the system, Marcus Thompson was finally free to rebuild his life. As they left the courthouse together, Marcus stopped on the steps and turned to Amara. "Why did you do it?" he asked. "Why did you give up being a judge for me?" Amara looked back at the courthouse where she had presided for 8 years, then at the neighborhood in the distance where they had grown up together. "Because 20 years ago, I made a promise to fight for justice," she said, "and I finally figured out what that means." 6 months later, Amara Williams returned to the bench as a judge, but with a different perspective on justice and second chances. Marcus Thompson enrolled in a paralegal program and began working at a nonprofit organization that provided legal aid to low-income families. Every few weeks, they would meet at the old oak tree in their childhood neighborhood, sharing stories about their work and planning ways to help other kids who were growing up the way they had. The promise they had made as children, to work together for justice, had finally been kept, just not in the way they had originally imagined. Sometimes the most important cases aren't the ones that make headlines or set legal precedent. Sometimes the most important cases are the ones that remind us why we became lawyers and judges in the first place, to ensure that everyone, regardless of their past mistakes or current circumstances, has access to justice. And sometimes, the best way to honor the law is to remember that behind every case number and legal brief is a human being who deserves to be seen, heard, and treated with dignity. This story is dedicated to every person who has been written off by society but refused to give up on themselves, and to every lawyer and judge who remembers that justice is not about punishment, but about redemption and second chance.